Welcome back, everyone, to another reaction video. Well, we're going way back today. This was one that was requested over on Discord, and don't do a lot of ancient history. I'm trying to do more, and I actually have a friend who was born in Iran who asked me over the summer about how much I covered this part of the world in terms of history, and I told him I didn't do nearly enough because I just didn't know nearly enough. So today we're going to take a look at our friends, kings and generals, and their video, Rise of the Neo-Assyrian Empire. So we're heading over to ancient Mesopotamia, to a place where there were a lot of powerful empires over time, some that we know better than others. So I think this will be a good learning experience for all of us. I'll offer some feedback where I can, and hopefully we will all learn together. As always, the link is in the description, so you can check it out without my commentary. Kings and Generals does a fantastic job with this type of documentary, so I'm excited to see what they have to say about it. And I want to thank my friend Angelique, who just raised her commitment on Patreon up to the producer level. And this will be the first video, Angelique, where you see your name show up at the end. I don't update those all the time, so I just made that change. So thank you. Thank you, thank you. I know you've been through a lot in your life, and I'm so glad that you are part of this community. Let's dive into this one.
The end of Bronze Age civilization in the Eastern Mediterranean world initiated a Dark Age which, from Egypt to Anatolia to Greece, reduced living standards, humbled once proud empires, and turned prosperous maritime trading kingdoms into shadows of their former selves. However, there was one great Mesopotamian state which managed to weather the storm and eventually emerged from it as the most powerful and arguably the most merciless state in Near Eastern and possibly world history, the Assyrian Empire. The Old and Middle Assyrian empires had waxed and waned for almost a millennia by the time Bronze Age civilization came to an end in the late 2nd millennium BC.
What blows my mind about some of these empires when we're talking about this part of the world where civilization really began, the Assyrians, the Babylonians, the Hittites, the Egyptians especially, is how long they lasted, and how our modern idea of nations is such a recent thing. The United States is, in a year we're celebrating 250 years. That seems like a really long time to us as Americans, but in the grand scheme of these empires, we are babies.
During that 1,000 years, Assyria was merely one of many competing states in Mesopotamia and the Near East.
Yep.
During its earlier imperial periods, Shamshi-Adad dominated much of northern Mesopotamia in the 18th century BC. At its weakest, however, the Assyrians had even been subjugated to vassaldom under the Kingdom of Mitanni, but always seemed to resurge and grow in power again. By the late 10th century BC, the declining Assyrian polity had been diminished by Aramaean invasions, left controlling only its traditional core region in the so-called Assyrian Triangle on the upper reaches of the Tigris River. Despite that fact, kings in this era still considered themselves rulers of all the previously conquered territory seized by Middle Assyrian kings.
So it's incredible to think about. On a world map, it doesn't look that big, but they've got land on the Mediterranean Sea. They've got these mountains here in what is now eastern Turkey. This is a lot of the area now that would be Kurdistan, but Syria as well, which is, Assyria, but then all the way over here into what is modern day Iraq. And this is hundreds of years before the Roman Empire is even, the Roman Republic or the Kingdom of Rome, which I think is like 753 BC. So we're a couple hundred years before Rome even exists.
Such as Tukulti-Ninurta I that were now lost. It was this gulf between imperial expectation and reality which led to the Neo-Assyrian reconquest. While the surrounding polities had been weakened by the Bronze Age collapse and were still recovering, Assyria was dynamic and demographically vibrant, allowing it...
I want to say too, if you are somebody who studies the Old Testament of the Bible, this is the rough period around the time of King David, King Solomon, 10th century BC. That's the estimate on that. And we don't have a lot of archaeological evidence for people like David. We do have stuff from later kings in Israel and Judah that talks about the house of David, so we know that there was a royal house descended from David. But, that's right here on the edge. So Assyria obviously is somebody they would have been dealing with.
Its kings to once again pursue an expansionist agenda. Beginning in roughly 934 BC with King Ashur-dan II, and continuing with his successors, Idad-nirari II and then Tukulti-Ninurta II, brilliant military expeditions began to recapture the Assyrian territories that their predecessors once ruled. This process culminated in the reign of Ashurnasirpal II, whose name can be translated as "the god Ashur is the creator of an heir." He is one of the most famous Neo-Assyrian kings, whose reign we are well informed of by numerous royal reliefs. Under his august rule, the great armies of Ashur were far from sated, and he began to direct expeditions to areas never before touched by Assyrian arms.
And it makes sense they would go this way. You've got the Tigris and Euphrates rivers running down in here. This is kind of the cradle of civilization, running down toward the sea.
Parts of northern Babylonia, Zamua, an area in the north near Lake Urmia, Armenian highlands, and the Kashiari Mountains all became subject to the iron will of Ashurnasirpal. The king also crossed the Orontes River in the northwest with an army, founding Assyrian colonies there, and essentially launching a commercial expedition. He even managed to extract vast sums of tribute from the wealthy Phoenician cities, and extracted valuable timber from the Levant.
What's amazing is that we know so much about this stuff, and a lot of it got left behind in the remains of these cities. We have these tablets that record, not always just the great conquests, but also occasionally the really mundane stuff.
Despite the primarily economic motives for Ashurnasirpal's western expeditions, its further-reaching implications are also incredibly important. Never before had Assyrians, with their desire for stable control, placed a colony so far away from their center, and it paved the way for the centuries to come.
And this indicates to me that if you're placing colonies far away from your center of business and center of government, that you're projecting strength, and that kind of tells you a little bit about at least their mindset and at least their stability at that time. What makes this region so difficult to understand is all the competing empires that kind of overlap each other. Like I said at the beginning, when you have the Assyrians and the Babylonians and the Persians and the Medes, and you have these smaller kingdoms that are all happening at the same time as well. It just all kind of overlaps and sometimes runs together.
Back in the homeland of Ashur, on the Tigris, Assyria's capital, Ashur, was also the center of all worship of the Assyrian pantheon of gods, the most important and powerful of which was also known as Ashur. This god was strange in Mesopotamia, as it was not a celestial entity like Enlil or Marduk, but was actually a deified version of the rock formation on which his temple stood. Interestingly, Assyria is not what the people themselves called the land. They called it Ashur. So the country was called Ashur, as was their god and their city. The fact that Ashur was a holy city didn't stop what Ashurnasirpal II did next, in what was perhaps his greatest achievement. Taking advantage of the great wealth which was entering his treasuries from constant success in war, the king began sponsoring construction in Assyrian cities from Nineveh to Ashur. However, his greatest achievement was the building of a vast, beautiful new capital city known as Kalhu, modern Nimrud, beginning in 879 BC. The site already had a decaying old settlement of some kind before the works began, but this project was a different thing altogether. Ashurnasirpal employed thousands of corvée laborers and deportees to build several colossal palaces and glorious temples. Massive winged bull statues fashioned from stone were placed as fearsome guardians at the entrances to the king's northwestern palace, and extensive rows of carved stone blocks were decorated with depictions of various scenes designed to show the king's greatness. In one of these reliefs, two figures bear tribute to the Assyrian king. The first is probably a man from Syria, who can be seen clenching his hands and raising them as a symbol of submission.
So one of the things at this time that you're going to do as a monarch is you want to leave something that lasts, something that's going to talk about you. Every generation has that. There are books later on for people, but even things like in the 1060s, you're going to have the Norman invasion in England, and you're going to have them leave the Bayeux Tapestry to tell a story. You have Trajan's column talking about his victory over the Dacians in the early Roman Empire. So this is just the Assyrian way of being able to project their history and project the greatness not only of their empire, but especially of their monarch.
The second may be a representative from Phoenicia, and comes to Ashurnasirpal to grant his master a pair of monkeys. Word must have gotten around that Assyrian kings loved collecting exotic fauna. In 864, Ashurnasirpal celebrated Kelhu's completion by inviting, according to an Assyrian inscription, 69,574 guests.
Wow,
Among
that's a
them,
really
16,000
exact number. And that tells you something about, I mean, they're not guessing, they're not making it up at that point.
citizens of his new capital, and 5,000 foreign dignitaries from surrounding realms. They were provided 10,000 pigeons, 10,000 jugs of beer, and 10,000 skins of wine,
Wow.
along with numerous other foods and beverages in a grand feast.
I mean, this is all about showing your power and demonstrating. And again, this is something that people do. Look at the 1930s in Germany. If you've ever been to the Eagle's Nest above Berchtesgaden, that wasn't a place that Hitler liked hanging out because it was a cool vacation home. That was about projecting the glory of his empire. The gold-plated elevator, the long hallway that you went down. That was all about showing off to foreign dignitaries.
All would know that this was the grandeur of Ashur's new realm. Go home, Ashurnasirpal must have thought upon the party's conclusion, and tell your petty kings of my glory.
Don't mess with me.
The prestige of creating such a glittering new capital would no doubt have been good enough, but there were probably other practical reasons for its construction beyond just aesthetics. Kelhu was located dead center in the Assyrian Triangle, its points made up of Ashur, Nineveh, and Arbela. His new city was therefore right in the middle of the Assyrian world, more adequate for governing a rapidly expanding empire in a more convenient fashion. Ashurnasirpal might have wished to assert his independence from the great noble families of Old Ashur by just relocating central power away from them. They had been incredibly influential up until this point, and probably served as an obstacle to an increase in central power.
Right, and this is his. This is something that he can claim and other people can't.
Somewhat revealingly, Kelhu's direct governance was granted to a eunuch upon the city's completion, rather than one of the powerful aristocrats of Assyria.
A eunuch can't have families, can't pass this on to somebody else.
Eunuchs were generally seen to be subservient and devoted to the king alone, and for this reason were to become massively powerful over the next 2.5 centuries. The most powerful of their number would serve as everything from royal chariot drivers and cupbearers to provincial governors and generals. Ashurnasirpal ruled from his new fortified citadel until 859 BC, when his son and successor Shalmaneser III took the throne. Continuing in his illustrious father's footsteps, his reign was yet another series of stunning campaigns directed against Assyria's traditional enemies, as well as the Neo-Hittite states around and beyond the Taurus Mountains, which were bent to their knees and forced to pay tribute. However, as we all know, expansion on such a scale has a price, and for the Assyrians, that price now had to be paid. In the late 820s, either slightly before or after Shalmaneser III's death, the Neo-Assyrian Empire descended into a state of weakness, known in Professor Eckhard Fram's Companion to Assyria as the Age of Magnates. It's entirely possible that this time in Assyrian history was initiated by a civil war between royal sons.
That's the one threat you have to deal with when you're passing things on from one powerful monarch to the next generation, is can we hold it together? We see Alexander the Great, his got divided up at his death. We see within a couple of generations of Charlemagne that his kingdom gets divided up. We see this happen so often.
or possibly even a rebellion by the aforementioned aristocratic clans against what they saw as sidelining by the monarchy. Whatever the case truly was, it does seem that after this internal strife, noble power dramatically resurged. In the 3/4 of a century period, lasting from the late 820s to 745 BC, 5 kings reigned, but it seems that true power resided with various governors, family members, and high officials, especially the king's field marshal. The reign of Adad-nirari III stretched from 810 to 783, for example, and for the most part in that time, power lay with his commander-in-chief, Nagal-Ila'i, and his mother, Samu-Rammat. It makes sense because her son was only a child when installed on the throne of Assyria. This might have been engineered. After all, an infant king is a weak king who can be controlled.
It's all at that point. It's all about who is able to wield the power in the name of the king. But the problem is the king eventually grows up, and then you either have to overthrow him or he's gonna at some point want to take that power for himself. This is what happened when Edward III's mother usurped the throne with her lover Edward Mortimer from Edward II. At some point Edward III said, "You're ruling on my behalf, I'm not actually ruling," and he has to kind of do this dead of night sneak attack on a castle in order to be able to get his throne back.
This Queen Mother's extraordinary authority is revealed to us in a stele dated to the year 805, which mentions her and her royal son as equal guarantors of the official border between 2 feuding vassal states.
Wow.
Moreover, she is also mentioned together with her son on religious statues constructed by the governor of Kalhu at the time. Finally, Samu-Rammat was probably the very first woman in Assyria to be commemorated on a stele in the holy city of Ashur, which were designed to honor the memory of the kingdom's rulers. Interesting.
That's a big deal. I mean, and you see in other cases where women have that authority, but then as soon as they no longer have it, whoever comes along next wants to wipe out any memory that ever happened. You know, we saw that in Egypt with Hatshepsut, where they're like trying to no, it didn't happen. We don't remember her, and they do the same thing with Akhenaten, who worships one god, and so they try to erase his memory afterwards.
Interestingly, many scholars now believe that this Assyrian queen was the inspiration for the future legendary figure Semiramis, who is mentioned in numerous Greek sources centuries after this point. It's possible that her ability to successfully rule the great empire made her memorable enough to mythologize after her death. Historian Susan Wise Bauer commented that Samu-Rammat's hold on power was so striking that it echoed into the distant historical memory of a people just arriving on the scene. In effect, she was the Empress Wu of Neo-Assyria. We don't have time to cover it here, but we recommend that you read up on Semiramis for yourself, and perhaps we'll do a video about her in the future. Carrying on with the story, throughout the mid-8th century BC, the strongest figure in Assyrian politics was a military commander named Shanshi-Ilu, a man who directed military campaigns and ran the affairs of state. He essentially performed all the functions of a king, while sidelining his monarch and only formally respecting the king's authority. Governors of large Assyrian provinces also asserted their individual authority and power in the regions which they ruled, often competing with one another despite remaining unified under the rule of the Assyrian king. It was at this moment, when Assyria was at its weakest, that enemies finally decided to strike. In the middle of the 8th century, king of the rising northern state of Iratu, Saduri I, crossed his border and intervened in the fractured Neo-Hittite states, forming a strong anti-Assyrian coalition and presenting a plausible threat to the weakened state's existence.
Right, so you have a situation in Assyria where you don't have a strong king, so you don't have unity, which means you're fractured. Guys are more concerned about fighting each other and getting more power and more influence for themselves than enemy threats. Meanwhile, the enemies are successfully uniting. I mean, this is a recipe for disaster.
At a similar time, Shanshi-Ilu passed away, and a revolt broke out in the capital at Kalhu. We have hardly any information about it, but the king at the time was probably killed and then replaced by a man named Pulu. We know him better by the throne name he took, Tiglath-Pileser III. Under this possible usurper's effective leadership, as Hardcore History host Dan Carlin puts it, Assyria went on a kind of historical sprint.
Dan Carlin's documentary that he does, not documentary, but podcast that he does on the Assyrians is phenomenal. I mean, everything he does is phenomenal. And he himself would say that he's not a historian, but he absolutely is. He is doing so much to promote learning and understanding of these events in history, and he does such a fantastic job of describing them in a way that you really can kind of feel yourself there. And that's what a good historian does, is to help you fall in love with that story and to want to know more about it and to learn from them.
And began a meteoric rise in power. Indeed, the blistering speed at which Assyria recovered from its low period can be attributed to this truly great reformer. Above all was the viewpoint that the interests of Ashur's great empire could no longer be served by the aging imperial system of Ashurnasirpal. It would have to be changed to fit a great empire, the greatest empire the world had ever seen, and the culmination of ancient Sumer's millennia-long history. Like any Assyrian monarch worth his salt, Tiglath-Pileser began a series of brutal lightning conquests in all directions in order to assert the final supremacy of his kingdom to all who thought that the centuries-long weakness had declawed it.
Right, so you've got to unify, you've got to consolidate power, you've got to make sure that everyone knows you're the boss, they need to submit, because then you can harness that power and strengthen your kingdom and fight the enemies from outside.
First, though, he needed to revamp the Assyrian army into a truly fearsome fighting force. Before Tiglath-Pileser, Assyrian militia armies were only called up in the summer due to the fact that the soldiers, mostly peasants working in agriculture, had to service the land and reap the harvest in May before being called up by July. This yearly cycle was probably one of the limiters on Assyrian domination in the times of Ashurnasirpal, as an army can only conquer so much in a year without economic dislocation.
Right, and this has been the norm for most groups of people for most of history to this point. And this is one of the things that's going to help the Roman Empire, for example, be so powerful and hold on to that power for as long as it did, is that they have standing armies, and those standing armies are in the field. They're not having to march to those places. They've got basically armies of occupation that are ready at a moment's notice.
Hereafter, tribute-giving clients would give way to full Assyrian provinces. This was done away with and, amongst other reforms, was replaced by a permanent army with contingents raised from each of the provinces, supplemented when needed by units provided by vassal realms, whose service was a part of the tribute they were obliged to pay.
That's a game changer to have a standing army, to have soldiers who are not only always ready, but therefore are trained and equipped and better prepared than a seasonal army would be.
The Kisir Sharuti, or standing army, acquired a multi-ethnic, multicultural aspect, with foreign troops marching alongside native Assyrian units. A later king reports that he even integrated 50 Israeli chariot teams into his force. They were issued Assyrian uniforms and equipment, thereby becoming indistinguishable from one another in the ranks.
Right, we read about this happening in the Bible. It talks about when the northern kingdom of Israel is conquered, and their young men are hauled off, and many of them become advisors, they get raised in the palace, and they become culturally integrated. This is what a good empire does, is it pulls out the very best of the peoples that it conquers.
A large Assyrian corps of troops continued to exist primarily within the cavalry and chariot forces, the strike elements of the army. At an even higher level were the Kurubti Sheshepe, the king's personal elite bodyguard. In the first years of his reign, which began in 745, the Assyrian army conquered Babylonia in the south, the consequences of which would affect Assyria until the end of the empire. The conquest was completed relatively quickly, but Babylon, being the revered and ancient civilization that it was, required special treatment. So, after defeating the Chaldean tribes that had occupied the area, Tiglath-Pileser took the step of becoming king of Babylon, instituting a kind of dual monarchy. In the very
like Austria-Hungary, it's Assyria, Babylon.
same year, the army pivoted north and shattered Urartu's strength, forcing its king to flee for his life. Assaults on that mountain kingdom would continue until it was finally annihilated in the late 8th century, weakened so much that a new nomadic group, the Medes, managed to conquer it. In the west, the empire's borders were again pushed further than ever before, even approaching the borders of Egypt and provincializing client kingdoms along the way.
Yep.
To more completely subjugate and pacify newly conquered territories and treacherous vassals alike, the king formally, and on an unprecedented scale, reintroduced a policy of mass deportation and forced population movement.
And again, this is about the time, it's going to be just a little bit after this, that scholars of the Bible will say that a lot of the Old Testament is going to be written, is during the exile, the Babylonian exile, when they're deporting many of the people from the northern kingdom of Israel, southern kingdom of Judah, eventually later, over to Babylon. And the reason I keep referring to these is because this is the part of the story that I know. This is the part of this area's history that I'm familiar with, is what's described in these Old Testament books, which even extra, like people who don't believe that it's the Word of God, but look at it as literature, say that this is pretty close to the time when that's going to start being written.
In 744, for example, Tiglath-Pileser decreed that 65,000 people were to be taken from their homes in Iran and settled on the Assyrian-Babylonian border on the Diyala River. 2 years later, 30,000 people from the Syrian region were deported to the Zagros Mountains. Those human beings who were deported were usually people considered most likely to rebel against Assyria. By decapitating possibly dissident elements in this way, it was hoped that subjugated lands would remain amenable to their Assyrian overlords and remain subjugated.
So they're kind of hostages, but they're also maybe some of the best of the people. So you're removing the most influential, the most intelligent, the most capable, and maybe even retraining them and kind of re-educating them and making them into loyal citizens.
To top it off, deportation allowed the Assyrians to transport people with valuable skills, such as administration, construction, and financial management, across the empire to where they were most needed. Within his empire, Tiglath-Pileser also acted decisively to ensure that central rule would never again be challenged and undermined as it had been in the age of magnates. To do this, he took the provinces of the empire, many of which were very powerful territories in their own right, and sliced them into smaller, more administratively effective pieces.
Completely reform it and redo it, make it easier to manage but also easier to control.
Within 7 years of his ascension to the throne, over 80 of these provinces existed, and loyal eunuchs were appointed to govern many of the new divisions in order to further undermine the provincial elites.
Right, and again, eunuchs can't reproduce.
To monitor this system, Tiglath-Pileser set up a small administrative layer of officials responsible for inspecting the state of His Majesty's holdings and then reporting back to the king on the performance and loyalty of his governors. We've heard of Achaemenid Persian and Mongol usage of horse-borne postal services, but this, as far as we can tell, was actually an Assyrian innovation. Communication stations were set up across the empire, from which riders could deliver orders to the provinces. It also allowed the delivery of reports from the provinces, containing amongst many other general matters, intelligence from operatives in the spy service which had been set up by Tiglath-Pileser to monitor states beyond Assyrian borders. With these reforms, the Neo-Assyrian Empire entered its golden age, and we will talk about them more down the line. So make sure you are subscribed to our channel and have pressed the bell button.
All right, that was good. It's a period I don't know a lot about, so I love learning something new. Some of you, I know you know way more about this particular topic than I do, so this is where we're going to rely on the community. Add to the conversation. Talk more about this. Let's learn together. Let's share what else was going on in this time. What didn't they mention? What do you think they should have talked more about? Let us know in the comment section below, and we'll see you again soon. Thanks for watching.